Sorry. I thought something.
Okay. Hey, folks. So this is our U.S. history course, and it is April the 6th. And so we're picking up where we left off on the presidency of Ronald Reagan during the 80s. And so we were talking about the foreign policy stuff when we left off. There were troubles in the Middle East regarding Palestine and the Israelis. And you remember we had some bombings on a U.S. embassy and a Marines barracks. And that led to many Americans' deaths. And so this is just another one of those things that showed that there was a lot of instability in that part of the world, but we as America were caught up in it. By the way, I posted the updated notes in a Google Classroom, so you can find our next set of slides at the end of that document. All right, so it's the 80s, and the Cold War's still going on. But luckily, this is when we it start to end. And in fact, in 1989, it will end. So you see this image, these are kind of like short-range nuclear missiles that the United States has and the Soviets have. And what makes these dangerous is that they can be put relatively close to a country and fire into them. And so that's no good. Nobody wants that. Well, luckily for us, in 1987, under Ronald Reagan, we're going to sign the first treaty to actually reduce the amount of existing nuclear weapons. So we're going to see nuclear weapons, at least promises to have them destroyed, so that some of our stockpiles. So that's good. Instead of just saying we won't build more, both countries start getting rid of them. So. In 1985, Russia's new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, I think he was like party leader at first for the Communist Party, and then he's going to become president, something like that. Well, he's going to push the Soviet Union in a new direction. Unlike the other leaders of the Soviet Union, he's actually going to take steps into trying to help the Russian people have more civil rights, but also try to prevent nuclear war. Gorbachev wished to reduce the war tensions with the United States, reduce his country's military spending, and to aid the Soviets' failing economy. So Ronald Reagan, it was very expensive, but if you remember, he really built up our military. And by doing so, the Russians tried to keep up. Unfortunately for them, our economy was stronger. It was very expensive, and it put our country in debt, but it broke their country's back trying to keep up. They wound up spending like most of their country's wealth on maintaining their military, and it was a failing military anyways. And so because of this too, however, they were having it wasn't just the government in Russia that was hurting financially, it was also the people. And they were having a very hard time even getting things like food. They faced, I think it was like several years of drought. And so their farmers weren't even able to grow enough wheat. And so Gorbachev was like begging America, will you please send us food? And so, yeah, we were sending them food at this time to help feed their people. And we were both trying to come up with agreements to try to stop trying to like point nukes at each other. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, I think that's how you say it, which was restructuring, and also glasnost, openness, led to truth of communist oppression to be aired out in Russia and would lead to the dismantling of the USSR. Before this time period, authors such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had lived through Russian oppression and through the work in the death camps known as the gulags, published books read throughout the world about what was really going on with the spy networks and the executions, the torture, and the prison camps that went on in Soviet Russia, especially in the 50s and the 60s. and has just how terrible all of this system was and how it's built on lies. Well, Gorbachev saw that maybe it was time to turn things around. They saw that in America things were so much better than in Russia. And if they could just have just a little bit of that, things would be a lot better. So in 1987, Gorbachev agreed to reduce nuclear armaments thanks to Ronald Reagan's negotiations. That same year, the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, was signed. And so that's what I was talking about, were those the first actual nuclear weapon disarmament. And good thing too. So ever since the end of World War II in the 1940s, we're going to have this face-off between the two most powerful militaries in the world. And we're finally starting to see it cool down. Right. So here we have a picture of, this is Ronald Reagan at the end of his presidency. He's going to visit Berlin. If you remember, Berlin is split in half. You have the free side, the west side, and then you have the side that's living under a police state in the east. And so that Western country saw to giving independence to the western half. And they had their own freedom. And on the east, however, things were so bad that 1 out of 3 people living in East Berlin had actually at least one time or another been an informant, like turning in a neighbor for like a spy network. Like they were so busy watching out for one another and paranoid, they were like telling on each other. And so that sometimes people would be disappeared and go off to the prison camps. Like it was that bad there. And it was divided by the Berlin Wall. So following the signing of the INF Treaty, Reagan then visited the Berlin Wall and called for Gorbachev to tear down this wall, calling for an end to the oppression of Soviet satellite countries. So the satellite countries were those countries that Russia took over and then pretended that they were independent, but really controlled them from behind the scenes. So he was calling for their independence. During the 80s, the world would see rapid changes in technology, such as personal computers, the invention of cell phones, VHS, movie players. The internet is going to be around, but it's going to mostly be around just for military use. It's going to be very simple and crude. A lot of things that have to do with medicine are becoming more advanced. The world's becoming more and more connected through flight than ever before. American culture, such as movies and music, is really going to reach out and start hitting a lot of countries. And so this is when a lot of the world starts wearing blue jeans and stuff like that. So we start seeing that a little bit more of a recognizable America that we can understand today. However, America and the world would be shaken by a new disease known as HIV and its corresponding syndrome known as AIDS. Some criticized Reagan's virtual lack of response to the disease as the STD cases rose rapidly during the U.S. or throughout the U.S. I remember, like, I was a kid in the 80s, and people didn't know a lot about AIDS, right? And so people didn't know how you could get it or what it would do to you. Everyone knew it was bad. And so people were really scared at first. It took time for people to understand that it actually could only be transferred through blood or through intimacy, and they didn't understand that you could be around people with it and not get sick. Some folks at first thought that it was something that only happened to like gay people until cases came up with straight people. Like there was a lot of misunderstanding with it. But you will see a lot of nonprofit organizations come up and a lot of scientists and doctors come together to try to combat this disease. And I think today they've come up with a lot of treatments, but there's still no cure. Of course, it's not a big deal as it used to be, from what I understand. Of course, there are some countries that are plagued by it pretty harshly. All right, so, well, as you know, according to the U.S. Constitution these days, a president can only be in office for 2 terms. And so at the end of Reagan's term, his vice president, George H. Walker Bush, is going to be the next guy to come up. You have to remember, Reagan was a very popular president at the time. Now, Congress and the Senate weren't. And so he would lose popularity in the legislature, but him as a person, he was very famous. And so the person he nominated had a lot of oomph behind him, a lot of momentum. So following his second term in office, Reagan endorsed his vice president, George H.W. Bush, for the presidency. So he's the father of the other Bush, the one that you probably remember. In the election of 1988, Bush rode on the success of Reagan and won 426 electoral college votes to his opponent's 111. And that opponent was Michael Dukakis, and that would be his last run for presidency. Having lived as a World War II pilot, oil executive, and ex-CIA director, Bush was groomed for the position, as he was also a Yale graduate. I think his family was very well-to-do before all this, with a lot of deep connections. It was kind of like he was made to be in a high office. He ran with the promise of read my lips, no new taxes. So after entering office, however, Bush quickly sought to distinguish himself as separate from Reagan. Sorry, I'm stumbling. And even asked that all of Reagan's appointees resign from their positions. And so what we see here is we see a split in the Republican Party. And so, like we've seen splits in the Democrat Party earlier. And so even though he was Reagan's vice president, he wants to make sure that people think that he's independent. But also, if I remember right, Reagan was more aligned with what they call the conservative element of the party. And I think Bush was more of the kind of like the central establishment side, kind of like Ford before him. And so he had different policy goals. As his presidency progressed, he would see a need to rescind his promise on taxes. So, he ran promising that he wouldn't bring taxes up. And that was a pretty popular bipartisan issue. Whether you prefer Democrats or Republicans, people didn't like having more of their money taken out of their paycheck. But all of that military spending in order to end the Cold War is going to be expensive, and they're not going to shrink the military yet. So maintaining all of that is going to have to come with a price. I think we got one more, and the rest I have to wait till Thursday because I haven't made them yet. So, right, Rebecca? Mm-hmm. Last one. All right, so here we have the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. And what's funny is that when this happened, protests at the wall were a regular thing. As you see, people would like to face it with graffiti. They saw this as a symbol of oppression. There were parts of the wall where they had machine gun nests where they kill people. Some parts had razor wire. There are even some parts on the east side, the Soviet side, that had like landmines. So this was seen as like a horrible, horrible, evil thing. It separated families. Like people literally couldn't see family members that hadn't seen each other since World War II. And so eventually you're going to have a protest, and people are just going to start pulling pieces of it down, like Reagan asked. And the cops and stuff like that aren't going to stop them. They're just going to watch it happen. In fact, I think one of your teachers, like Miss Wells, had like pieces of it. Like I think she went down there. So George H.W. Bush. In Bush's terms, the country faced a debt of around $2.6 trillion, which probably doesn't sound like that much anymore. And unlike Reagan, he was not willing to cut social programs in order to offset the expenditures. So what that means is that if you remember, Reagan was like, I don't want to raise taxes, but I need to build up the military. So he cut spending to pay for that from social programs such as Medicare and Social Security and stuff like that. Bush was like, well, those cuts have already been placed. I can't cut any more of that. So I'm going to have to raise taxes because he didn't want to cut the military either. He wanted all the toys. Well, then you got to pay for it. So in 1990, Bush proposed a set of taxes that divided the Republican Party and angered much of his voter base. His popularity was further hampered by yet another economic recession in 1991. It was kind of like the 70s all over again. However, things looked better internationally as Soviet troops left Afghanistan in 1989. So that was finally over for them. And Gorbachev declared that Russia would no longer coerce international dealings of their allies. And not just that, but the internal ones too. Like he's like, okay, we're no longer going to go in and force your governments to do certain things. If you want to run things your own way, we're going to let you do it. And this is going to be the thing that just has everybody like, okay, we don't want to be part of this anymore. And all these countries are going to leave the Soviet Union. Once they say you can leave if you want to, everybody leaves. It was that unpopular. So, and that's going to end it for today, kids. We're going to come back, and I think we've got just a couple more parts to go through. And then that'll be it, and the rest will be review. So, see you later. Yeah, let me see.